Hey, welcome to the latest episode of the Project REM Charger. We are now just about to get to the core of the matter with this 440 engine and pull the crank and rods and stuff out of it so the block can go to the machine shop and get ready to be turned into a 513, 100 cubic inches bigger than the 413 Max Wedge that is going to be going into the 62 Dart police car soon. But before we do that, it's kind of cool. In the last video, we noticed when we took this thing apart that it had a double roller timing chain, which is not factory, at least not in an engine from 1975. So somebody might have been inside of here. And one nice thing about this is the bottom gear, the crank gear, comes off by hand. Sometimes these things are pressed on or just don't want to come off because of a burr, but that's a sweet little detail. That's nice. Another thing too is a lot of folks, when they put their big blocks together, they go to fire it up and I don't know what's going on. I don't have any fuel pressure. You got to remember to put the fuel pump push rod in position. This little guy right here, this is the fuel pump push rod right here, and it lives inside of this. It runs off a lobe from the camshaft, but if this is not in place, it won't be running your fuel rod or your push rod for your fuel pump. So don't forget the fuel pump push rod. Okay, with that said, the camshaft is going to come out. Now we're going to throw this away. I hate to say it, but here is getting the cam out. And again, this is a hydraulic cam. Not sure if it's the original one, probably not. But again, it doesn't look too crazy, but I'm looking more at how the lobes are, and they look okay. You know, so this engine had pretty decent maintenance. I didn't see any dished or cupped lifter bottoms. So, you know, again, this is not something we're going to use again, but out with the old, in with the new. Now, something about this particular engine that absolutely confirms it's from a truck is the oil pan right here. This is a front sump pan seen only on truck applications. Passenger cars will have the classic Mopar center sump where this hump is in the middle of the pan structure. So, you know, it's definitely a truck-based oil pan. So how they got this into the station wagon demo derby car is beyond me. I'm going to bet that the demo derby thing didn't really happen. Because sometimes, you know, engines wind up in a junkyard. The guy says, I got 5 engines. I think that's the one that came out of, who knows, who cares? But so far, we're seeing a pretty good 440 core. So let's take this off of here. And here's the question. Will we find a windage tray inside of this thing or not? Let's take a peek. Yeah, it's glued down real good, so that's typical stuff. People put tons of RTV. All right. Yeah, okay, cool. This windage tray right here is something that would have been found on 68 up 440 high performance engines and 383s like in Roadrunners and Coronet RTs and stuff like that. Also street Hemis used a windage tray. But here's the thing. These were available from Direct Connection or Mopar Performance. Speaking of which, Mopar Performance recently became Direct Connection again. But anyways, with that said, this windage tray, what this thing does, it keeps the oil in the pan away from the spinning crank where it can cause something called windage. Of course, that means that the crankshaft is paddling its way through the oil, and that's drag, and it can eat up about 5 or 10 horsepower. So that's cool. Somebody, when they rebuilt this puppy, put in a windage tray. Here is the oil pickup specific for the front sump truck type oil pan. And let's scrape this baby off of here so we can access the connecting rod bolts and start to get the pistons out of here. Now these pistons should be cast flat tops, but you know, you never really know because, again, somebody's been in this engine. The double roller timing chain, the windage tray, and it's possible this thing has forged pistons. I did see flat tops up top, so in other words, they're not high compression, but they are definitely, you know, it's possible there might be some forged pistons inside of this thing. Not that we're going to reuse them, because you don't really want to reuse pistons unless you're stuck on Gilligan's Island, right? So, okay, off with this thing. And out. Okay, there it is. This is the legendary Chrysler big block. Now, unlike Chevy small blocks where the main bearing caps and the block and at the center where the crankshaft is, Chryslers have this deep skirt right here. It adds a lot of rigidity to the block, which is a nice thing. It also adds a lot of weight, there's no doubt. And I mentioned in an earlier video that the 426 Street Hemi head in cast iron is 10 pounds lighter than a Chevy big block cylinder head. Weigh them yourself, you'll find it's true. But the other side of the coin is that that weight advantage is thrown away. The Chevy big block, being a short skirt type deal, is definitely at least 30, 40 pounds lighter than a wedge block. Now keep in mind, this is a wedge block, not a Hemi block. And we know that because we don't see cross-bolted mains, which you'd find on the center three. There'd be a bolt right here on a Hemi block. And also Hemis on this corner here, all four corners are squared off and have an internal oil passage. Wedges are always angled right there. So that's a quick way to tell a Hemi block from a wedge block. If it's square here, Hemi, rounded wedge. And of course, no full bolt mains. Okay, let's now get to taking these rods out of here. And here's our 8th and final piston. I've taken these all out. Why bore you with all that stuff? But again, the process of removing the pistons, you try to be as gentle as you can. Now, these are not going to get used again, but we thought maybe these would be aftermarket pistons, but no, these are Chrysler cast flat top pistons. And in a 1975 440, these probably had 8.6 to 1 compression. So these were well down below the deck, little tiny bit. But again, not a high compression, not a high performance piston, just standard stuff. But the good news is that each of the pistons still had its skirt, which is kind of nice. None was broken off, or they're certainly not fresh. I wouldn't say they're collapsed, but this thing probably had a little bit of piston slap. But certainly probably ran well enough, except for that dead number 2 exhaust spring and valve, which of course would have been a dead hole. But the rods on these things are looking pretty good. Now keep in mind, the nice thing about Chrysler big block rods is that they were all forged. We can see that parting line on the side, which is actually a broach mark. It's quite wide. Cast rods, like you find in a Pontiac 389, have a really thin little line right there, that armor steel stuff, which wasn't great. But again, forged 440 and 383 rods are good stuff. Might reuse these, you know, I mean, you could, but in our case, we're going to get a 440 source 512 stroker crank, or 513, and that'll come with billet rods, an aftermarket crank, all the good stuff, which is very cool. And certainly, as we know, rod bolts are one of the most important fasteners in any engine. You always want to use the best rod bolt you can, SPS, ARP, etc. So again, this is stock stuff. It's scrap metal is really what it is. So that's all out of there. And here's the cap, so all that's out. Now here's the thing, the final deal is getting the crankshaft out. Not a big thing, so here we go. Now, this is, again, the classic Chrysler deep skirt wedge block, the RB and B family. And these are 2-bolt mains. You know, everybody talks about 350 Chevy, 4-bolt mains, where there's an extra set of fasteners going down on each side. And what those do is they do a pretty good job of maintaining oil pressure and the oil film between the crank and the bearing by preventing the bearing cap from deflecting and bouncing up and down. But that's something that is a cumulative damage in high RPM situations for long periods of time. The cumulative effect of the bearing walking up and down because of weak fasteners. So that's where 4-bolt mains really come into play. As far as maximum strength goes, 2-bolt main blocks are pretty strong too. And again, these are all 2-bolt mains, all these 383 and 440 blocks, Mopar stuff, except for Hemis, of course, which are cross-bolted. But that's a whole different family of block. They're cousins to the 440, but not the same. So anyway, off with these fasteners. And again, I've had a bunch of experience with big block Mopars. I had a 520 cubic inch stage 5 Hemi conversion. That was basically aluminum Hemi heads that were designed to work on a wedge block. And it used a 69 Chrysler Newport engine block, which is what I used in that Dart. And that thing made, I don't know, like 610 horsepower, somewhere around there. And it was, you know, that block held in, did fine. You know, I did have ARP studs, main cap studs, which are, you know, a nice way to increase the clamping power of those 2-bolt main caps. But I used the stock forged caps, and that thing ran a long time. I had a billet crank, and that thing ran well. So the 2-bolt main thing is not an issue at all at this performance level, that's for sure. You know, Bonneville with a couple of turbos making 1,300 horsepower, you know, then you might want to consider a Hemi block or something a little more rugged. Okay, so these caps want to come off. There's one, 2. All right, let's take a peek at, this is the thrust bearing, the third one in, and this is the one that maintains end play. Now on this, we'll get a sense of if this engine has ever been restored or rebuilt. Oh, look at this. Okay, this bearing is the original one. It says 1174 on it, which lines up with the 1174 casting date of the block. So this block was cast in November of 1974 and assembled very shortly thereafter, thus these bearings. And something to keep in mind too, that generally speaking, the casting date of a block is within a few months of the assembly date of the engine and car that it goes into. But there's one big exception to that. If you have a 1978 or 79 Pontiac Trans Am, especially a 79, and you have a 400 in that, you'll have, I think, a 1978 engine block casting in your 79. And a lot of guys think that's not the original block. Well, when Pontiac dropped the 400, they knew there would be a demand. So they cranked out a bunch of 400 blocks, and then they ran them out for the next 2 years, which is why brand new or as new unrestored Pontiac Trans Ams with 400s in many cases have blocks that are 2 years older than the assembly date of the car. But when it comes to Mopars of this period of time, the big block 440 and 400 were gone after 1978. So this is kind of near the end. But yeah, this block has never been rebuilt, or at least not the main bearings. Kind of weird. Okay, let's do the Charles Atlas routine and lift this crank up and out of here. Now this is a cast crank, so it's a little bit lighter. Oh, there we go, right there. Let's weigh this thing and see how much it does or doesn't weigh. And there we have it. It is just about 55 pounds right there. So this is about 9 pounds or so lighter than a forged crank. And, you know, keep in mind that if you're building, you know, 400 to 500 max horsepower, no nitrous, no superchargers, no turbos, naturally aspirated, these cast cranks are just fine. And one thing too, as you know, if you see a cast crank, you can spot it a mile away. You'll see things like very thin parting lines where the two molds go together, leaving this little lip. A forging has a much wider parting line or a broach mark there. And on a forging, you can never get crisp digits like 440 right there. But that was put on this thing to help folks in the assembly line at the Trenton, Michigan plant not grab a 400 crank and put it into the 440. So these things were readily identified. But again, a cast crank like this one here is externally balanced. So you will have the external damper up front, and at the rear, the torque converter will have weights added to it, not the flex plate, but the torque converter. So if you ever change converters on a 440 or even a 360 small block or a 400 with external balance, remember, you got to change the torque converter or switch to a B&M flex plate, which is pre-balanced to accommodate the external balancing of your cast crank V8 Chrysler engine. So that's the news on this. We have taken this 440 from a junkyard jewel, and we've got it ready to go to Donald Wood and the folks at Rad Auto Machine in wonderful Ludlow, Massachusetts, where they'll pressure test it. I hope to heck they find 8 happy, healthy cylinders. And for the most part, all we really need is this block, the crank, the rods. This stuff is not something we're going to be using because we're going to have 440 source send us a 513 stroker crank assembly, and the stock heads on this, the 452s that we saw earlier, will not be being used. And I mentioned earlier the valve size. It's a 208 intake and 174 exhaust. So hold those emails. I had a moment there. I forgot what they were, but anyway, 174 is the exhaust, 208 is the intake on a stock 440 from 1967 on up. But anyway, we're not going to use those heads or valves or springs or any of that stuff because 440 source, again, makes the 440 Stealth cylinder head, which is aluminum. It's all new, ready to go for like $1,200. What's not to love? So that's the story here. That wonderful creature right there, the Project REM Charger, will be the home for this mighty Max Wedge. So as we go forward, we're going to keep rolling. So be sure to stay subscribed or subscribe to the Steve Mignonti YouTube channel. And while you're at it, if you haven't seen the previous videos, there's like, 13 or 14 videos that bring us up to speed on Project REM Charger. And there's going to be a whole lot more to come. So in the meantime, thank you for watching, and we'll see you again very soon.